Horror is perhaps the most persistent of all genres in cinema. From its earliest days as an art form, adaptations of horror novels came to be. Morality tales of beasts and killers fighting the forces of good, and as the years went by, the genre shifted its focus. In the 50s, there was a rise of alien invasions and giant monsters, a fear of others brought on by the Cold War. By the 70s and 80s, the fear of the other had transformed into another closer to home in the slasher genre, with the big hitters like Texas Chainsaw, Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street creating a whole slew of off-brand slashers that ran with whatever stuck. Writer and director of the original movie, Mark Jones, was primarily a television guy, working on Hanna-Barbera cartoons and network television action shows like The A-Team and Knight Rider, along with about 100 other, and was inspired to throw his hat into the ring when inspired by Lucky Charms to make an evil leprechaun movie. Somehow, despite this bizarre and wacky premise, the original movie was conceived as a straight-up horror. However, a rogue element saved the series. Warwick Davis, who got his big break as Wicket in Star Wars, but also played characters in Harry Potter, starred in Willow, among many others. And upon joining the franchise as the titular Leprechaun, he began riffing, adding comedic elements, and steered the series into a campy set of cult films he would be the face of for many years. Almost certainly never intended to be a franchise, that's about all there is to say on the series' production and beginnings broadly before the reboot era, so we may as well get to its humble beginnings. Leprechaun is certainly an odd one. Jennifer Aniston being here pre-Friends is a Titanic jump scare, but outside of that, the movie is quite quaint. Made for just under $1 million, a small amount even for 1993, this is largely a movie taking place on a farm in the middle of nowhere, and certainly feels like it. Plot is thin, Jennifer Aniston's father drags her to live in the middle of nowhere and she hates it, she's scared of spiders, hates the house, and is a stuck-up brat, but she quickly forces herself to stay to impress Nathan, a hunky painter, and his goober co-workers, his kid brother Alex, and the simple Ozzy. Our primary characters are not great. The romance between Jennifer Aniston and the hunky painter is about as stock as it comes, but I do occasionally find Ozzy and Alex charming. They have a genuine bond, and Alex looking out for Ozzy gives the movie a bit of a goofy heart. What really works here in this first century, of course, is Warwick Davis as the Leprechaun. He's a funny guy, absolutely taking over every scene, and the movie has plenty of funny gags even if it's still a bit kill-light. The scene where a police officer pulls the leprechaun over in one of those tiny kid cars and tells him to go home, assuming he's an unruly child, is a great gag that perfectly plays on the character and Warwick's height, and that he sells well with his annoyed expression. And the leprechaun being this kind of quirky, rhyming, whimsical little creature adds immensely to how he plays off of the mundane and boring cast, which is maybe why Ozzy and Alex so well, as their childlike wonder at finding the gold is what gets the plot rolling and keeps getting them in trouble. I think the trouble with this movie is primarily budgetary. There aren't really cool or unique kills. The leprechaun uses magic early on for some brief shenanigans, but with the flimsy excuse that without his gold his magic is weakened, they can save lots of money by turning him into a non-threatening, ankle-biting chihuahua who kills a few people off screen and is incapable of landing a hit on Jennifer Aniston, a JCPenney model, Simple Jack, and a child, which quickly deflates the tension, only to be broken up with some simple gags, and the movie doesn't even feature that much of leprechaun comedy and shenanigans towards the end, focusing instead on mundane drama. Leprechaun is an okay watch. It has enough fun moments to be enjoyable when the leprechaun is on screen, but it's probably because of its more straightforward conceptualization that it ends up a touch dull, not leaning as heavily on camp and comedy as later movies would, with its standout trait being that it's a very funny watch for St. Patrick's Day, and of course, the star that would carry the series into insanity. Leprechaun 2 is a pretty straightforward upgrade on its predecessor, primarily for its larger budget and knowing it's a goofy comedy going into it. The movie was directed by Roger Corman alum Rodman Flender, who would go on to largely be a TV episode directing type journeyman. For some reason, this movie was also known as One Wedding and Lots of Funerals in the UK. I have no idea why that was supposed to be more marketable than Leprechaun 2 over there. There isn't really a lot to say on the production of this movie, or any of them really. The first made money, so a year later its sequel was done and dusted. The movie's plot is very bizarre to say the least, beginning 1,000 years ago as the leprechaun attempts to use magic to marry his weirdly friendly manservant's daughter, but is thwarted and plans to do the same in another 1,000 years, leading him to kidnapping our protagonist's girlfriend to set up his wedding as he desperately searches for her. Our protagonist Cody is a young guy making his way in the world under the tutelage of his scumbag Uncle Morty, who runs a tour service around New York that shows off the homes of famous dead people. Lucy from Twin Peaks? Clint Howard. I can understand scamming Lucy, but would Clint fall for this? Morty kinda carries this movie. He's as sleazy and greedy as a leprechaun, not to be confused with Tony Cox, who plays the Black Leprechaun per the credits, who I thought was a funny addition, and his greed and antics keep giving the leprechaun ammunition to continue the chase, and his end is a fun play on that greed. Once he's gone, the movie burns out pretty fast. The budget wasn't notably higher, but the movie is a little more creative. The guy lawn mowing his own face off is fun, even if they were forced to cut away for budgetary reasons. And I'll be honest, the male pregnancy thing wasn't on my list and looks like they kinda just stuck some pillows in Morty's shirt. I would say it's the thought that counts, but honestly it looks so bad that I don't even know if the thought justifies it. There's also something of a bit, I don't know. Why is the leprechaun not funny in this one? He occasionally has a bad pun or joke, but the situational comedy mostly comes from the humans, while the leprechaun is just mad horny, doing everything he can to get with the main character's girlfriend, who's a functional non-character. It just never comes together in a way that's satisfying, and ends with a very bizarre sequence on a very small underground set, leading to the movie's one satisfying effect of an exploding leprechaun. Finally, something happens. And within like a minute and a half, our duo walk away happily ever after. The first movie set the bar pretty low. This can be a bad and boring movie with one enjoyable drunkard and still be generally more fun than the first, but that's the series I signed up for. There still isn't a ton to say, honestly. The movies took a while to make their premises wackier and wackier to the point that they became enjoyable in a bizarre slapstick way, so let's get on to the first of the many bizarre gimmick movies in this series. Leprechaun 3, sometimes referred to by the very subtle title Leprechaun 3 in Vegas, is where the series finally started to come together. Directed by Brian Trenchard Smith, an Ozploitation filmmaker beloved by Quentin Tarantino, whose post-Australia career would largely consist of direct-to-video, low-budget slop, a la this movie and its sequel. Maybe all the feet have gone to Tarantino's head, I don't know. Leprechaun 3 isn't shy about its conceit. The next several movies in this list are just, okay, now put the leprechaun in this setting that we can make gags for. And this one is a wide variety of Vegas-based gags. The first encounter with the leprechaun is in a scuzzy pawn shop as its owner watches leprechaun-themed exposition about the gold's ability to grant wishes and tries to fight off the little creature, which is admittedly pretty fun. The wishing gimmick does kinda change the status quo. It definitely leads to more interesting kills as the leprechaun is more, magical, but it also kinda turns this into just being a Wishmaster clone, which also had a weird fetishy casino movie, which is it's kind of crazy that it happened twice. And yes, I mean the writer's thinly disguised fetish type movie in both cases. The hypnosis attempted rape scene is one thing, you know, the casino boss is a bad guy. But the giant titty robot sex scene and the woman getting bimbofied, inflationed until her boobs explode and kill her hits different in a post-DeviantArt world. Moving past that, this movie's pretty fun. The characters in this movie have leaned much more into caricature, which gives the non-horny parts of this movie a silly, lighthearted tone that really works. I'm a big fan of the rude, flamboyant, incompetent magician. He's more or less Job from Arrested Development, and I like the Mafia Enforcer duo that are essentially a quintessential straight man and goofball duo, plus the main character going from a wide-eyed kid to a gambling addict to getting infected with leprechaunism and speaking in rhyme. Oh my god, it's so much fun. The love interest isn't nearly as silly as everyone else, but I guess you have to have someone kinda sensible around, and she's nice to look at. Despite being the first of the movies to move to direct-to-video, Leprechaun 3 feels like a massive step up. As goofy as the wish gimmick is, and as fetishy as it keeps getting, most of the movie seems like it had way more money and effort put into it. There's a series of sets that vaguely sell the casino, elaborate over-the-top kills, makeup for characters that aren't the leprechaun, and lots of goofs and gags that set a consistent tone with the leprechaun's quipping and antics. It's a fun, if a little uncomfortable movie. The setting provides a lot of room for fun set pieces, and they went all out with the silly premises. It's got a dumb charm to it that makes it an easy, goofy watch, maybe best suited to the Sci-Fi Channel for St. Patrick's Day, but certainly the first of these that deserves an actual recommendation for leaning into the campiness that the series demands, and that it would lean even further into in the coming movies. Also, didn't the leprechaun explode in the prior movie too? He explodes in 2 movies in a row. How does he keep ending up as a statue after being atomized? Leprechaun 4 in Space is exactly the kind of movie you'd expect from a brilliant title like that. Released in 1996, a half-decade before the extremely similar Jason X, presumably a coincidence, I'm not accusing Jason X of anything here. And like the prior movie, it was directed by Brian Trenchard Smith, who brings the same goofy energy in a very different, mostly underutilized setting. Leprechaun 4 is almost an Alien parody. It jumps to 2096 for no reason at all, and the Leprechaun is on a remote planet where he and a space princess agree to marry, both planning on killing each other after for power or gold respectively, but a group of space marines break up their plans. The Leprechaun dies, but his soul enters a marine's penis through his urine. Editor me, start a fetish counter or something. And the princess is injured and taken to the ship, where the ship doctor proceeds to grope her unconscious. Jesus fucking Christ. The pissed marine gives male birth to the leprechaun, hijinks ensue. This robot guy becomes a giant spider monster, the princess takes off her top several times for seemingly no reason, the leprechaun becomes giant, and like Jason X, he's ejected into space where he dies of inflation fetish. Quality effects work. I figured I'd just summarize the plot because unlike all the others, this one is just a bizarre little creature, somehow packed with even more bizarre fetish stuff than the last, and kinda just terminally silly. Leprechaun 4 mostly works, tonally anyway. The leprechaun carries, as always, having a decently fun back and forth with the princess who's disgusted by him, but has to play along for his gold, which lets him always have someone to play off of, and while not nearly as creative as the better slashers of the era, it does manage to scrape by with some decent practical effects work, primarily when it comes to the cyborg scientist. Oh, I almost forgot to include cross-dressing on the fetish list. Plus the scientist's spider form, although in other areas the movie looks almost as impressively bad, with just awful sets. All around, really, and very bad green screening, especially when the leprechaun is ejected into space. The movie borders on largely incomprehensible for much of its runtime, and you're kinda just asked to accept the insanity on screen, in a way even the similarly bizarre Jason X doesn't. And sometimes you get a fun treat for it, and other times you're kinda just mystified and bored simultaneously. For every fun moment, the Mecha Doctor is kinda just the highlight. There's 3 or 4 mind-numbing ones, and even when it gets flashy with a giant leprechaun, it's never very exciting. Despite saying that, Leprechaun 4 is moderately fun, it's very silly, dumb, and plays that card well, with silly jokes and premises, although it's gonna be very nice to get a break from the weird fetish shit. Well, I guess I spoke too soon on the fetish stuff. I can't even lie, the Leprechaun in the Hood duology is about 99% of why I was interested in doing the series. These movies are kind of the pinnacle of what the series could be, weird horror and genre fusions that play fast and loose with being goofy. In the late 90s, the Hood movie had become a surprisingly popular genre in wider American culture, with big hits like Dead Presidents, Juice, Boys in the Hood, and even more so with the comically inclined ones like Friday, Barbershop, and Wayans Brother Films. Don't Be a Menace would be their real Hood movie, but they would carry that same energy in the scary movie, White Chicks. Back on topic. Leprechaun in the Hood decided to tackle that with the bizarre element of a magical little white guy getting in the middle of everything, and it ends up with surprisingly fun results. Leprechaun in the Hood was released in 2000, was directed by Rob Spera, who made a handful of low-budget horror titles in the era, like the Friday the 13th knockoff sequel Bloody Murder 2, Closing Camp, and Witchcraft, the first entry in a 16-film series. I've never even heard of the first one. It seems it's on the more obscure side of Troma's releases, so I guess that explains why. Leprechaun in the Hood kinda just rolls with it. It begins with Ice-T as, I'm not making this up, Mac Daddy Onassis, finding the leprechaun, who proceeds to kill his friend with an afro pick, but Ice-T is able to use the medallion to turn the leprechaun into a statue, and uses his magical whistle, the movie's new MacGuffin, to make himself a wealthy music mogul. Our protagonists are Postmaster P, Stray Bullet and Butch, a rap trio who fail to impress Ice-T because they're kinda goobers. They rob him and accidentally free the leprechaun, at which point hijinks ensue, primarily with the trio using the flute to improve their music career while dealing with the leprechaun and Ice-T hunting them down for the flute. And some of the hijinks are pretty fun, like their extremely bad rap song they perform at a church, to much offense from the crowd.
Jesus loves me, this I know. If you don't,
Although some of the other songs are surprisingly decent for the kind of movie this is. We do, of course, get into the weird stuff eventually. There's a good bit of cross-dressing with the homosexual record producer they stay with for a while, and in the climax, where the protagonist dresses prostitutes because the leprechaun gets addicted to marijuana and women, and mind controls women into fucking him. It just fucking keeps happening. Also, the record producer tries to fuck the leprechaun too. It's bizarre. Despite being pretty fun, the leprechaun is surprisingly tertiary to this movie in general. Ice-T is a much more present villain, and he's fun in the role, but there aren't many crazy or over-the-top kills. The leprechaun is often just mind-controlling people into committing suicide, and most deaths are just like people getting shot, which isn't the most exciting outcome. Even in the ending, the leprechaun doesn't get some big finale. During the final confrontation, Ice-T dies and drops the medallion, with it being implied to fall on the leprechaun, but it seems that wasn't the case, as the leprechaun finally survived one, hypnotizing Postmaster P and concluding on a tremendously awful song. I think this one's awful on purpose, but it's still...
I come from the land of the Irish Spring. Dublin's the place where I learned my thing. From the Emerald Isle to your place in the hood, I'm the man of green, come to do no good. Lep in the hood, come to do no good.
Lep in the Hood is tremendously awful in a funny way, I think. There's no chance that they thought it was actually good. At the risk of sounding a little reductive, Leprechaun in the Hood is just good fun. It's like an early attempt at the Wayans-type silly humor that Scary Movie 1 and 2 would land very, very well. It's not nearly as funny or well-produced as those movies, but a good time. Probably the best movie in the series so far, and certainly the most unique one, and it did so well that its follow-up would keep the theme running. Leprechaun Back to the Hood, spelt with a numeral 2 and the, as in THA, is ironically, despite the insanity of the title, maybe the thing in this series so far that best resembles a real movie. I know that's a very low bar. Directed by Stephen Iromlui, best known for this and a few more movies in the dramas about black people genre. He is white, by the way. This movie kind of just fell out of nowhere in 2003, and it was the first entry released by Lionsgate. The most surprising thing is that they weren't involved before. Back to the Hood actually has a plot. Not a very good one, but it exists, about a group of young adults mixed up loosely into gang life, and the early movie is surprisingly Leprechaun light, at least until they turn their fortunes around with a big pile of gold, and our final girl tries to gather it all to return to normalcy, while taming her bad boy boyfriend. It's a hokey hood drama, but you get to know all the characters well beyond the typical amount in these movies. It is weird that this movie has the same setting as the prior, but literally no other connection or relation. I mean, it's weird in all the other movies that they just take place whenever and have no continuity, but it's really baffling when you use the same setting twice. I guess they just really loved the setting and knew people actually liked the last one. The Leprechaun stuff that is here is fairly fun too. I like that he casually walks into a party and he just agrees to smoke some weed and hangs out with a guy, getting along with him pretty well until he gets back on his gold grind set. It's stupid and wacky, but fairly fun, and most of the rest of the movie actually attempts to be a horror movie. The action scenes try their damnedest to be as tense as this premise allows, and quipping is kept to a minimum. There's even some passable effects, like when the leprechaun gets stabbed in the eye or when he dejaws the woman. The movie doesn't exactly nail what it's going for. It's hard to make a semi-serious horror movie on the premise of a tiny green man killing people in the hood, but it's fairly admirable that it swung for the fences and tried to play it a little more straight while having some goofy moments mixed in. It's probably the best of the movies so far from a technical and being a movie standpoint, although it's definitely not the most fun, and even then it's not the best by much. But it is by enough that I can at least half-heartedly recommend it, despite kind of backing away from the goofiness. Leprechaun Origins was a horrid mistake. For some reason, the series fell into the hands of WWE Studios, who primarily make terrible movies like the 6-film Marine franchise and Surf's Up 2, in a bid to force a variety of wrestlers down our throats. No, I do not know the hows or whys of the WWE's involvements, and it's even more baffling that they decided to go the dark and gritty route, perhaps in part as Warwick Davis wasn't interested, purportedly for the sake of his children, but I wouldn't be surprised if he read the script and went, no. Very reasonably so. Origins was directed by Zach Lipovsky, known for classics like the terrible live-action Dead Rising movie, I have seen that, the live-action Kim Possible movie for the Disney Channel, and the upcoming Final Destination Bloodlines. Ugh, I'm gonna have to update my video with that, huh? The trailer looks okay, maybe it'll be fine. What is there really to say about Origins? A group of students on a vacation to Ireland are tricked into going to a cabin in the woods as sacrifices for leprechauns who were robbed of their gold in the past. The leprechauns in this movie aren't really the little goofballs Warwick is, they're guys in demon masks. They may as well be goblins, demons, gremlins. The only leprechaun-y thing about them is that it takes place in Ireland and they had gold stolen from them. The movie is 90 minutes of people in the dark woods screaming while a guy in a Goosebumps tier removable mask goes ooga booga. That guy of course is Hornswoggle, a little person wrestler, but it may as well just be a puppet as most of the movie is bad POV shots, some of which are thermal shots like the Predator for some reason. There's no real plot, no real characters. The Irish people just want to sacrifice people for the leprechaun grunts. Two of the students are just death fodder, one is their final girl, one is their shitty boyfriend, and not much of anything goes on. Kills are just ooga booga demon bite with one minor exception. People wander around in the woods. It's so fucking boring. In all honesty, you'd think the WWE would cook something completely balls to the wall. It's what they do every single week live. But what we have is ultimately the most mundane, cheap, personality-less people in the woods type horror movie that could ever be made. It's utterly disastrous. Leprechaun Returns thankfully redeems the series. It's actually the best movie in the series, hands down, by a very substantial amount. Returns was directed by Steven Kostanski of Astron 6, the group behind The Void and the Red Letter Media classic Psycho Gorman. They make goofy, 80s style, gory horror movies, and Returns does that really well. It's got the weird Halloween thing going on, ignoring everything besides the first Leprechaun, although continuity was already basically not a thing in this series, and serves as the only real direct sequel in this entire franchise. Following Jennifer Aniston's daughter, who ends up at the old farm as part of a green living sorority project, coincidentally, after Jennifer Aniston dies a crazy hermit. Look, I didn't say it wasn't dumb. Warwick Davis did not return, instead we got Lyndon Parocco, who was the body double in Little Man and Cult of Chucky. He does a fine job. I think they gave him lots of fun physical stuff to do, and while he leans a bit more annoying and squeaky, in part intentionally, it works in a campy sense. Characters remain flat, although I think the movie leans into them being awful to make it more amusing to see them die. And the movie does have some genuinely funny little gags and moments, but there is a notable returning character worth mentioning, Ozzy from the first movie. Because the Legacy sequel elements aren't too bad, honestly. Ozzy is pretty quickly killed, becomes a friendly mute ghost. It's a bit odd, but I think it creates some good jokes, and these movies have always gone to weird places anyway. And there's some offhanded references to Jennifer Aniston going crazy from trauma and dying of cancer. It's a bit intense. Regardless, the movie's fun. We've been given a solid collection of over-the-top kills, done largely practically. Why did the mailman have to die? I don't know, but I'm glad he did. It's fun. Also, we finally get to see the weird male pregnancy kill come back, but in a way that doesn't, look like this. The movie also goes delightfully off the rails in the end. The leprechaun's initial destruction leads to him splitting into dozens of bite-sized leprechauns. Undeniably silly and wacky, it matches the tone of the movie well. Leprechaun Returns is just a fun movie. Simple, goofy, and full of that gory goodness that's been missing in the Blumhouse-atized world of today. I don't have any major issues with it. It basically perfectly succeeds at what it wanted to do, to be an enjoyable throwback to the slasher movies of the 80s, just crammed in a mostly crappy series that caused it to go largely overlooked. The Leprechaun franchise turned out to not be as amusing as I expected. The problem is, most of these movies are just kinda cheap and dull, Returns notwithstanding. The movies don't have any true cohesion, there's no connective tissue in the Leprechaun's power or weaknesses, the settings, the storylines barring one exception, and they're usually at best a collection of half-baked kills with an occasional gem, or a piece of gold in the mix. The movies peak when they go all in on being over the top and silly, as Hood and Returns were, while everything else is the kind of Full Moon Studios-esque, no-budget, nothing-happens movies, and even some of the full swings, like In Space, just don't carry themselves that well. Leprechaun has, despite that, become oddly iconic, largely thanks to how stupid the premise is. They fall into an odd novelty of terrible ideas for horror movies that kinda drag them along to finally getting a genuinely good one right at the end. The true low of the series is when they tried to play it straight, because this concept really does not deserve to be played straight. It seems that Leprechaun is coming back later this year, so we'll see how that turns out, although my expectations aren't very high. But a pinch of silliness and a fun concept go a long way in this franchise, so maybe they'll manage it again.